I still clock in every night at 11. That's probably the part people don't expect when I tell this story. They expect me to say I quit, that I ran, that I never went back. I didn't. I go back 6 nights a week, and I follow the rules, and most nights nothing happens at all. That's the part that scares me more than anything else now. How normal it became. I didn't think much of the binder when Russell first set it on the counter. That was probably my first mistake. My name doesn't matter much for this, but I'll give it anyway. Dana. 24. I dropped out of a master's program in environmental science 8 months before I took this job, and I was the kind of broke where you start doing math in the grocery store, putting things back before you reach the register. I'd been a teaching assistant, then I wasn't, and after that the apartment got too expensive and I moved into a smaller one above a laundromat in a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, just a 4-way stop and a feed store and a diner that closed at 2. The gas station was called Norbeck's, after the family that used to own the land, though nobody named Norbeck had run it in decades. It sat on County Road 9, the last stop before the highway disappeared into Callaway National Forest. 40 minutes of 2-lane blacktop with no other lights until you hit the ranger checkpoint on the far side. Hunters used it in the fall. Truckers used it because it was the only 24-hour pump for 60 miles in either direction. Campers used it to fill up before they vanished into the trees for a week at a time. The pay was $9.50 an hour, which even then felt like a joke, but it came with the overnight differential, free coffee, and this was the part that actually got me to sign, a single room above the store, rent-free, in exchange for working the graveyard shift 7 nights instead of 5. I did the math. Free rent plus a paycheck, even a small one, was more than I was making at the apartment job I'd had before. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things were temporary that year. The manager who hired me wasn't the one who trained me. That was a man named Russell Atchison, 60-something, gray beard kept short, the kind of quiet that isn't shyness so much as a habit of not wasting words. He'd worked the overnight shift at Norbeck's for almost 11 years, he said, and he was finally retiring to go live with his daughter in Spokane. I was his replacement. He had exactly 1 week to train me before he left for good, and he used most of that week teaching me things that had nothing to do with ringing up cigarettes or running the register. The store itself was unremarkable in the way these places always are. 2 aisles of chips and motor oil and fishing lures. A coffee machine that hissed when it finished brewing. A bathroom around back with a key on a piece of wood shaped like a fish. 4 pumps outside under a metal awning that hummed faintly all night, a sound I got used to so fast I stopped hearing it within the first week, except on the nights it stopped, and then the silence was its own kind of loud. There were 2 cameras. One pointed at the register, one pointed at the pumps. Both fed into a small monitor under the counter, black and white grainy, the kind of setup that looked like it hadn't been upgraded since the 90s. There was a CB radio bolted under the counter too, an old one, the kind truckers still used on that stretch of road because cell service died about 4 miles before you reached the store and didn't come back until you were 10 miles past it. Russell showed me all of this the first night, walking me through the register, the safe drop procedure, the restroom key, the way the second pump sometimes stuck and you had to reset the breaker. Ordinary stuff. Mundane stuff. I remember thinking, this is fine, this is just a boring job in a boring place, and I will save enough money in 6 months to figure out what I actually want to do with my life. The room above the store was smaller than my old bedroom growing up, a twin bed, a hot plate, a window that looked out over the pumps instead of a yard, but it was mine in a way nothing had been mine in a long time, and that counted for something. Russell told me the room had always come with the job, going back further than he could say. He told me not to bother decorating much, not in an ominous way, just practically, the way you'd tell someone not to bother painting a rental. I didn't think anything of it then. I unpacked 2 boxes of books I never got around to reading and left the walls bare, and within a week the room felt less like a place I was staying and more like an extension of the store itself, a place where the hum from the pumps under the window became as familiar as a heartbeat, where I'd fall asleep some mornings still hearing the coffee machine cycle in my head even after I'd shut it off hours before. We worked 4 nights together before he handed me the binder, and looking back, I think he was studying me during those nights more than he was training me. He'd watch how I handled customers, how I reacted to a truck idling too long in the lot, whether I jumped at the bell over the door or just glanced up calm. I didn't understand at the time that he was deciding something about whether I'd be able to hold steady once he told me what came next. I just thought he was a careful trainer. Maybe he was both. It was on the 3rd night that he brought out the binder. It was black, 3-ring, the plastic cover cracked along the spine from age. Russell set it on the counter between us like it weighed more than it looked like it should. "This isn't store policy," he said. "Corporate doesn't know about this, and you're not going to tell them, because they'll just tell you it's superstition and then 6 months from now you'll be gone and they'll hire someone new who doesn't know any of it. So I'm telling you instead. Person to person." I laughed a little, because I thought he was setting up a joke. He didn't laugh back. He just opened the binder to the first page, where someone, not him, the handwriting was different, older, looping in a way that suggested it had been written decades earlier, had listed 6 numbered rules. "Read them," Russell said. "Then I'll explain what I can." Which isn't much. I read them. I'm going to write them out here exactly as they were, because I think the order matters, and because I think you should sit with them the way I had to. Rule 1. If a customer pays an exact change down to the penny, ring them up and say nothing else. Do not ask if they found everything okay. Do not wish them a good night. Rule 2. If the second pump's display shows a number higher than what is being pumped, do not go outside to check it. Wait for it to read 0 on its own. Rule 3. If someone knocks on the back door of the storeroom, do not answer it. The storeroom has no back door. Rule 4. If the CB radio picks up a voice asking for directions to Norbex, give them the directions once, clearly, and then turn the radio off until your shift ends. Rule 5. If you see headlights pull into the lot and no vehicle is there when you look again, log the time in the binder and do not go outside for the next 10 minutes, no matter what you hear. Rule 6. If a customer asks you what your name is, you may tell them. If they tell you your name back to you, correct yourself, give them a different name, any name but your own, and remember which one you gave. I read them twice. I remember asking him if this was some kind of hazing thing, a joke they played on new hires, and he just shook his head slowly and said, "I wish it was." He didn't explain much that first night. He told me the rules had been in that binder since before he started, that the woman who trained him, a woman named Glow, gone now, he didn't say where, had told him the same thing someone must have told her: follow them, don't ask why, and don't test them just to see what happens. He told me he'd broken one of them, once, in his 2nd year, and that he still didn't sleep right on the anniversary of that night. He wouldn't tell me which rule. He wouldn't tell me what happened. He just looked at me for a second too long and said, "You'll be fine if you follow them. Everyone before you was fine, mostly, as long as they followed them." Mostly. I noticed that word. I didn't ask about it. That was probably my second mistake. Russell left for Spokane on a Friday. I worked my first solo shift that Saturday night, and for the first 4 hours, nothing happened at all. A few truckers came through, paid with cards, took their coffee and left. A teenager bought a tank of gas and a bag of beef jerky and didn't say 2 words to me. I sat behind the counter doing homework on my phone, half watching a true crime documentary with the sound low, and I started to think the rules were exactly what I'd assumed, a strange old joke that had calcified into ritual the way these things do in small towns, passed down because nobody wanted to be the one who broke the chain. Then, around 1 in the morning, a man came in to pay for gas on pump 3. He set a small stack of bills and coins on the counter. I remember it was $11.43, the exact total on the screen, down to the cent, and I almost said it without thinking. "Did you find everything okay?" The words were halfway up my throat before I remembered the rule. I swallowed them. I rang him up in silence. He nodded once and left. It felt stupid. It felt like nothing. I told myself it was a coincidence, that people pay exact change all the time, that the rule was just an old superstition some previous employee had cooked up because of one weird interaction years ago that got mythologized into store lore. That would have made sense, except for what happened to the security footage. I didn't think to check it that night. I only thought to check it 3 nights later, when I was bored around 3 a.m. and scrolling back through the saved clips out of idle curiosity, the way you do when a job is slow and your phone's battery is dying and you need something else to look at. I pulled up the footage from Pump 3, that first Saturday, timestamped 1:06 a.m. The man was there. The pump was there. But in the 11 seconds between him stepping up to pay at the window and stepping back from it, the footage skipped. Not a glitch, not static, it just jumped clean, like a bad edit, from him reaching toward the counter to him already walking away. I went back and watched it 4 times. 11 seconds gone, no distortion, no error message, nothing in the file properties to suggest tampering. Just gone. I didn't mention it to anyone. There wasn't anyone to mention it to. The day manager, a heavy-set man named Carl who unlocked the store at 6 a.m. and barely looked at me before grabbing the deposit bag, wasn't the kind of person you brought this up with. I considered calling Russell. I had his number from the training week. I almost did, twice, and both times I told myself I was overreacting to a glitchy old camera system in a building that hadn't seen an upgrade since before I was born. The second incident came 11 days into the job, and it was the one that made the documentary watching, half-believing part of my brain go fully quiet. It was a Tuesday, nearly empty, the kind of night where the loudest sound in the building is the hum of the coffee machine's heating element. Around 2 a.m. a truck pulled up to Pump 2, not the second pump from the rule. I want to be clear, this was Pump 2, the rule was about Pump 2's display, the second one in line from the store, and I want to be precise about this because precision matters in a story like this, and a trucker came in to grab a coffee while it filled. I was watching the monitor, the way you do without really watching it, eyes drifting back to the small grainy square every minute or so out of habit. I saw the pump display tick upward the way it should, the gallons climbing, the dollar amount climbing with it. Then I looked back at my phone for maybe 90 seconds. When I looked up again, the display read $214.06. A truck doesn't hold $214 worth of diesel. Not even close, not at the prices we had then. I stared at the number for a long second, feeling that particular kind of confusion that hasn't yet curdled into fear, the kind where your brain is still trying to find the mundane explanation. A glitch. A meter malfunction. Something with the breaker Russell had mentioned. My hand was actually on the door before I remembered the rule. If the second pump's display shows a number higher than what is being pumped, do not go outside to check it. Wait for it to read 0 on its own. I stood there with my hand on the push bar, looking out through the glass at the pump, at the trucker still inside grabbing creamer for his coffee, oblivious, and at the display ticking, not climbing now, just ticking, the way a stuck odometer flickers between 2 numbers, between $214.06 and a string of nines that filled the whole screen. I let go of the door. I went back behind the counter and I watched it from there instead, through the window, my heart doing something uncomfortable in my chest. The trucker came up to pay a minute later. His actual total was $61.10. He paid it without comment, didn't seem to have noticed anything wrong, thanked me, and left. I looked back at the pump display once he'd gone. It read $0. It had reset on its own, exactly the way the rule said it would, exactly the way it was supposed to if I just didn't go out there and look. I didn't sleep that day. I lay in the little room above the store with the blinds shut against the noon light, staring at the ceiling, running the numbers again and again. $214.06, then the nines, then 0. Trying to find a version of events where this was explainable by faulty wiring and nothing else. I almost talked myself into it. Almost. That would have made sense, except for the part where I knew, with a certainty I couldn't logically defend, that if I'd opened that door, something would have been standing at the pump instead of the readout climbing on its own. I didn't know why I believed that yet. I want to pause here and talk about the smaller incidents, because I think it's a mistake to only remember the big ones. The pump display and the camera skip were the kind of thing you can't talk yourself out of, but in between them were dozens of smaller moments that, taken alone, meant nothing, and taken together meant everything. There was the night the coffee machine finished brewing twice in a row without me touching it, the second pot appearing and the carafe still steaming though I'd already poured the first one out 20 minutes earlier and hadn't started another. There was the morning I found the inventory clipboard hanging from its nail upside down, the pages fanned out the wrong way, though I distinctly remembered hanging it right side up the night before. A thing so small I genuinely couldn't be sure if I was misremembering or not, and that uncertainty itself became its own quiet erosion. There was a stretch of 3 nights where the second aisle's motion light kept tripping on its own, flooding the chip rack with white light for exactly 4 seconds before going dark again, on a rhythm too even to be a sensor malfunction, though I told myself that's exactly what it was because the alternative wasn't something I wanted to sit with at 2 in the morning, alone, 40 minutes from the nearest stoplight. None of these were rule violations. None of them were even covered by the binder. They were just texture, the kind of low ambient strangeness that made the rules feel less like an old employee's superstition and more like documentation. Someone, years ago, had sat down and written out only the dangerous patterns, the ones worth a formal warning, and left everything else for the next person to simply absorb on their own, the way I was absorbing it now. I started keeping my own list, separate from the binder, in the Notes app on my phone. Not rules. Just observations. I told myself it was for my own peace of mind, a way of externalizing the noticing so it didn't just rattle around in my head unspoken. I don't know if that helped or not. I kept doing it anyway. I want to talk about Carl for a minute, because the next stretch of the story is mostly about how normal everything felt, and how that normalcy became its own kind of pressure. Carl was the day manager, 50-something, ran the store like it was the most unremarkable job in the world, because to him it was. He'd worked days at Norbeck's for 6 years and had never, as far as I could tell, worked a night shift in his life. When I tried, once carefully, testing the water, to ask him if he'd ever heard anything strange about the overnight binder, he just frowned at me like I'd asked him something in a foreign language. "The inventory binder?" he said. "No. There's another one. Under the counter. With rules in it." He looked at me for a second, and something flickered behind his eyes that I couldn't place. Not recognition, not confusion, something closer to a man deciding not to follow a thought to its end. "I don't go through that stuff," he said. "Night crews always had their own systems. Long as the till balances, I don't ask." That was it. That was the whole conversation. I went back to my room that morning feeling more unsettled than I had after the pump incident, because I'd expected him to either confirm something or dismiss it outright, and instead he'd done neither. He'd swerved around it, the way you swerve around a pothole you've hit enough times to know exactly where it is. The store itself never showed any sign that anything unusual happened in it. The morning after the pump display, Carl ran the same checklist he always ran, counted the same till, restocked the same shelves, and the whole building felt, in the flat gray light of 7 a.m., like the most boring place on earth. That was almost worse than if it had felt haunted. There was no acknowledgement anywhere, not in the cameras, not in the register logs, not in Carl's face, that anything had deviated from ordinary. Just me, sleep-deprived, carrying a memory that the world around me seemed determined to deny. I want to be honest. There were stretches after that where nothing happened for days, sometimes more than a week, and during those stretches I genuinely started to doubt myself. I'd reread the binder on slow nights, turning the pages, looking at that looping old handwriting, and wonder if I'd imagined the camera skip, exaggerated the pump number in my memory, let two ordinary technical glitches snowball into something supernatural because I was lonely and underslept and 24 and scared of my own life. The stores sold the doubt back to me every morning, dressed up as routine. I almost want to tell you it would have been easier if something had happened every night. The waiting was its own kind of erosion. The third rule I tested, not on purpose, not really, but tested all the same, came about 3 weeks in, on a night thick with early autumn fog that made the road outside disappear past the first 100 feet of pavement. The CB radio crackled to life around midnight. It did that occasionally, truckers chattering on the open channel, mostly meaningless, weather reports and complaints about the state troopers further down the highway. I didn't usually pay attention to it. That night, something made me look up. A voice came through, male, calm, slightly distorted by the radio's old speaker. "Anyone got eyes on Norbex? Need directions in. Lost the turn off 12. I picked up the handset before I even thought about the rule. This was just a customer, I told myself, just a lost driver in the fog, and there was a rule about exactly this: give the directions once, clearly, then turn the radio off. "This is Norbex," I said. "You're looking for County Road 9. If you're on 12 you want to turn just past the old grain silo, there's a green sign, easy to miss in this fog. Take that south about 4 miles, we're on your right." There was a pause. Then the voice said, "Thank you, Dana." I hadn't given my name. I sat there with the handset still in my hand, my mouth dry, replaying the last 30 seconds in my head to make sure. Yes, I was sure. I had said this is Norbex, not my name, never my name. I didn't say my name to strangers on the radio, that wasn't a thing I did. The rule didn't say anything about what to do if the voice already knew my name. It just said give directions once, then turn the radio off until the shift ends. So I did. I reached down and flipped the power switch, and the static cut out mid-hiss, and the store went quiet except for the hum of the pump awning outside. No truck ever came. I watched the lot for the rest of that shift, every set of headlights on the distant road making my stomach drop before they passed by without turning in. By 6 a.m., when Carl unlocked the front door, nothing had come down County Road 9 all night except 2 truckers I recognized from other nights, both arriving from the opposite direction, both completely unbothered by any fog-related detour. I didn't mention it to anyone. The rule came back to me before I even reached for the handset that next night: turn the radio off until shift ends, every time, no matter what, and from then on I left it off more often than not, even when I knew that meant losing legitimate customers who might genuinely be lost on the unlit roads outside. I didn't know why it mattered yet, that the voice had used my first name instead of asking who I was. I'd find out later that it mattered more than almost anything else in this story. The storeroom sat behind the coffee station, a narrow space lined with shelving for backstock, cases of soda, motor oil, the big tubs of ice melt we sold once winter came in. It had one door, the one that connected to the main store. Russell had been very specific about this during training, almost oddly specific, the way you're specific about something because you know the person you're training won't believe you the first time. That storeroom has one door, he'd said. One. The one you and I are standing in right now. There is no back door. I need you to actually picture that in your head before I tell you the rule, because the rule won't make sense otherwise. I nodded along at the time the way you nod along at anything during a long training week, more focused on memorizing the register codes than internalizing geography. It wasn't until the night of the knock that I actually understood what he meant me to picture. It was close to 4 a.m, the dead hour, when the highway gets so quiet you can hear your own pulse if you sit still enough. I was restocking the cigarette case from a logged order, a task that took me into the storeroom for maybe 10 minutes at a stretch. I was crouched by the lower shelf, checking case numbers against the inventory sheet, when I heard 3 knocks. They came from the far wall. Slow, evenly spaced, deliberate, not the rattle of a loose pipe, not wind against siding. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks again. I want to be honest about my first instinct, because I think it matters for understanding how these things work on you. My first instinct wasn't fear. It was confusion, the ordinary kind. Is someone outside? Did a customer wander around back? Is this Carl playing some kind of joke? And confusion is what almost got me to answer. I actually stood up. I actually took 2 steps toward the sound before the rule surfaced in my mind, fully formed, in Russell's voice. The storeroom has no back door. I stopped where I was, 10 feet from the wall the knocking was coming from, and I made myself remember the floor plan. The storeroom was an interior room. The wall the knocking came from didn't lead outside, it backed onto the walk-in cooler, which itself had no exterior access, which itself backed onto the rear of the building where there was nothing but a 6-foot gap of weeds and a chain-link fence before the tree line started. There was no door there. There had never been a door there. There was, by any reasonable architectural logic, no possible way for a person to be standing on the other side of that wall knocking, because the other side of that wall was either a sealed cooler or open air 30 feet off the ground level grade, the building being built into a slight rise at the back. The knocking continued. 3 pause 3. It didn't get louder or more insistent. It had a patience to it that I think about more than almost anything else from that whole stretch of my life. The patience of something that wasn't trying to convince me, only waiting to see what I'd do. I backed out of the storeroom, leaving the inventory sheet where it was, and I shut the connecting door, and I stood behind the counter for the rest of that shift with the coffee machine's hiss as the only sound I let myself focus on. The knocking stopped sometime before 5. I didn't go back in to finish the restock. I told Carl the next morning that I hadn't gotten to it, that the night had been busier than usual. He didn't ask for details. He never asked for details. I checked, later that week, out of a need to be sure rather than any real doubt, pulled up the building's old permit records at the county office on my day off, found the original floor plan from when Norbex was built in 1974. 1 door into the storeroom. Exactly as Russell had said. There had never been a back door. I want to slow down here, because this is where the rules stopped feeling like a list of strange precautions and started feeling like they were building towards something, the way individual notes start to sound like a melody once you've heard enough of them. It happened on a night in late October, cold enough that I'd started keeping a space heater under the counter, the kind of night where the dark presses against the windows in a way that makes the lit interior of the store feel like a little lifeboat. Around 1:30, I saw headlights swing into the lot from the highway, the beams sweeping across the pumps the way it always did when a car turned in. I looked up from my phone, the way you do automatically, gauging whether I needed to put it down and stand up. The headlights settled, pointed at pump 1, the way a car does when it's pulling up to park and fuel. Then I looked down to lock my phone screen. Maybe 2 seconds, no more, and when I looked back up, the lot was empty. No taillights receding back onto the highway. No engine sound, not that I would have heard one over the awning hum, but no headlights either, nothing, just the empty pumps under the sodium light, the way they'd looked an hour earlier and an hour before that. I sat very still. I thought about Rule 5 before I'd even fully processed what I'd seen, which I think says something about how deeply those 6 rules had worked themselves into my reflexes by that point in the job. If you see headlights pull into the lot and no vehicle is there when you look again, log the time in the binder and do not go outside for the next 10 minutes, no matter what you hear. I pulled the binder out from under the counter, found a blank line on the log page at the back, other entries above it, and other handwriting, going back years, just times, nothing else, no notes, no explanations, just timestamps and different ink, and I wrote 1:34 a.m. Then I sat down behind the counter, where I could see the lot through the window but couldn't be seen easily from outside, and I waited. The first 2 minutes were nothing. The third minute, I heard footsteps on the gravel apron outside the pumps, slow, unhurried, the particular crunch gravel makes under a shoe rather than a tire. I did not go outside. I did not go to the window. I kept my eyes on the security monitor instead, where the pump-facing camera showed exactly what it should have shown if a person were walking across that gravel. Nothing. Empty frame. Just the pumps, the dark beyond them, the tree line a black mass against a slightly less black sky. The footsteps continued for what felt much longer than 10 minutes, though when I checked the clock afterward it had in fact been almost exactly 10. They circled, I think, moving from somewhere near pump 1 around toward the side of the building closest to the storeroom wall, the same wall the knocking had come from weeks before, and that detail bothers me more in hindsight than almost anything else. The way these incidents seem to be mapping out the same architecture from different angles. Learning the building, or learning me. At what I later confirmed was 1:44, 10 minutes after I'd logged the time, the footsteps simply stopped. Not faded, stopped mid-stride, the way a sound cuts when you turn off a speaker. I didn't go check. I'd learned that much by then. I have to talk about Rule 6 now, because it's the one that ended up mattering most, and because it's the one I misunderstood for the longest time. For the first month and a half, the rule felt almost beside the point compared to the others, a strange little formality. If a customer asks your name, you may tell them. If they tell it back to you, give a different one. I followed it mechanically when it came up, which wasn't often. Most customers didn't ask. The ones who did got Dana, same as anyone would, and I never once had a customer repeat it back to me in any way that registered as strange. It started to feel like the least important rule in the binder, a kind of leftover superstition with no real teeth. That changed on the night everything else in this story had been building toward, though I didn't know it yet when it started. It was a Thursday in November, the kind of cold where the propane tank exchange cage outside frosts over by midnight. Business had been slow all night. 2 truckers, a single car around 11 that didn't even stop for gas, just turned around in the lot and went back the way it came, which I'd noted but not logged, since it wasn't headlights vanishing, just an ordinary U-turn. Around 2:40, a man walked in. I want to describe him carefully, because I've gone over this part of the night more times than any other, trying to pin down what exactly was wrong about him beyond the obvious thing, the thing I'm about to tell you. He was maybe 40, dressed like any of the hunters who came through that time of year, canvas jacket, boots, the kind of weathered, unremarkable face you'd forget within an hour of meeting him under any other circumstances. He didn't seem threatening. That's important. Nothing about his posture or his voice or the way he moved through the aisles picking up a bag of jerky and a bottle of water set off any alarm in me, not at first. He set his items on the counter. I rang them up. $8.12. He paid in cash, a 10. I gave him change. Nothing about the transaction matched Rule 1. No exact change. No reason for caution there. As I handed him his receipt, he looked at me, not unkindly, almost conversationally, and said, "Long night?" "They all are," I said, which was the kind of small talk I'd give anyone. "What's your name?" he asked. I almost answered automatically, "Dana," the truth, the way I had a dozen times before with no consequence. But something in the rhythm of the question made me hesitate half a second, long enough to actually think about Rule 6 instead of reflexively obeying it on autopilot. "You may tell them." I was allowed to. There was no rule against the first telling. "Dana," I said. He smiled, small, polite, and nodded, the way anyone does at the end of a transaction. He picked up his bag. He turned toward the door. And then, with his hand already on the push bar, not looking back at me, he said, "Good night, Dana." That's it. That's the whole thing. He said my name back to me, which the rule accounted for. If they tell it back to you, correct yourself, give them a different name, any name but your own. Except he'd already left. The door had already swung shut behind him, the little bell above it still trembling, and I was standing there alone behind the counter, having technically failed to correct myself in time, because by the time the rule's condition had been met, there was no longer a person in the room to correct myself to. I felt something settle over me in that moment that I can only describe as a held breath. I waited for something to happen, a flicker in the lights, the radio crackling, anything, and nothing did. The store stayed exactly as ordinary as it had been all night. I told myself, with the particular desperation of someone trying very hard to believe their own reassurance, that the rule's window had simply closed naturally, that there was nothing left to correct because the interaction was over, that this was a loophole rather than a failure. I didn't mention it to anyone. I wrote it in the binder's log anyway, under the headlights entry, just the time and 3 words. 2:43, said my name. It was 4 nights later that I understood what Rule 6 had actually been protecting against, and understanding it didn't feel like relief. It felt like the floor tilting. I'd been rereading the binder on a slow shift, flipping past the rules page to the log pages in the back, the ones filled with years of timestamps in different handwriting, when I noticed something I'd skimmed past every other time I looked at those pages. Scattered among the timestamp entries, most of them just times, like mine, were a handful of longer notes, written by whoever had kept this binder before Russell, before Glow, going back further than either of their tenures. Most were illegible with age or too cryptic to parse. But one, dated almost 20 years earlier, stopped me cold. Rule 6 isn't about it learning your name. It already knows your name before it asks. It's testing whether you'll let it use your own name to answer for you. If it says your name back and you don't correct it, it isn't catching you in anything. It's getting your permission. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about the man in the canvas jacket, the bell still swinging, the door already shut. "Good night, Dana." I'd had no time to correct it because he timed it that way, set it on his way out, beyond the window where correction was even possible. The rule wasn't a trap I'd fumbled. It had been deliberately built so that I would fail it without ever having a real chance to succeed, the small print closing after the transaction was already final. I thought about what permission might mean for something that had spent weeks learning the layout of a storeroom with no back door, the readout of a pump nobody was actually filling, the contours of a parking lot that could hold headlights, and then not hold them. I thought about a voice on the radio that already knew to call me Dana before I'd told it anything. I didn't sleep well after reading that note. I kept thinking about the phrase getting your permission, turning it over, trying to figure out permission for what, and not finding an answer I wanted to land on. For almost 3 weeks after that, nothing happened. I want to stress how genuinely unsettling that quiet became, because by then I'd started to expect the incidents, had built a kind of low-grade vigilance into every shift, and the absence of anything to be vigilant about started to feel like its own kind of pressure, like waiting for a second shoe that refuses to drop, night after night, until the waiting itself becomes the haunting. I worked through Thanksgiving alone in the store, ate a gas station sandwich at midnight because I hadn't planned ahead, and felt sorry for myself in the specific way you feel sorry for yourself when you're 24 and broke and working a register in the middle of nowhere on a holiday while people you used to know are passing dishes around someone's parents' table. I called Russell once during that stretch, the only time I ever did, mostly because the quiet had started to feel less like safety and more like something gathering itself. He picked up on the fourth ring, sounded older than I remembered, asked how the job was going in a tone that suggested he already half knew the answer before I gave it. "Has anyone ever broken Rule 6? I asked him. I didn't tell him about the man in the canvas jacket. I didn't tell him about the note in the binder. I just asked the question plainly, the way you ask something you've been carrying alone for too long. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "Glo did," he finally said. "Before me. That's most of why I don't talk about her." "What happened?" Another pause. "I think you should just keep following the rules, Dana," he said, and something about the way he used my name there, plainly, kindly, the way a person uses a name when they're trying to anchor you to something solid, made my chest tighten in a way I didn't examine too closely at the time. "That's all I can tell you that'll actually help." He hung up not long after that. I never called him again. I didn't want to know more than I already did, and some part of me understood that he wasn't withholding out of cruelty. He was withholding because some kinds of knowing don't help you. They just sit in you, taking up space where calm used to be. There's one more incident from that quiet stretch I want to put down before I get to December, because I think it changed how I read everything that came after, even though at the time it felt like the smallest, most forgettable thing that had happened to me all year. The store had a clock on the wall behind the register, an old battery-operated one with a white face and read second-hand, the kind you'd find in a school hallway. I'd never paid it any real attention beyond glancing at it the way you glance at any clock, a habit more than an act of focus. It kept perfect time, as far as I knew, synced loosely with my phone, never more than a minute off in either direction. On a Tuesday in early December, a few days before the snow started, I looked up from restocking the register tape to find the second hand had stopped. Not slowed, stopped dead, pointed at the 4, while the minute hand sat between the 2 and the 3. I checked my phone. It read 2:17. I want to be honest that my stomach dropped before my mind caught up to why. There was no rule in the binder about a stopped clock. None of the 6 rules mentioned it at all. But I'd read that binder enough times by then, cover to cover, more than once, on the slow nights when sleep wouldn't come even after my shift ended, that I'd noticed, tucked into the margin beside an unrelated entry in someone's older handwriting, a single line that wasn't formatted like the rest of the rules, smaller, almost an afterthought. 2:17 means stay where you are until it moves again. Don't ask why. Just stay. I don't know who wrote that, or when, or what had happened to make them write it. It wasn't numbered. It wasn't part of the 6. It read like something added later, by someone who'd learned the hard way and wanted the next person to have it even if it hadn't made the official list. So I stayed. I stood behind the counter, both hands flat on the surface, watching that red second hand sit motionless on the floor for what felt like a very long time. The store was otherwise unremarkable, the coffee machine ticking as it cooled, the awning humming outside, the highway empty in both directions. Nothing knocked. No headlights came and went. The radio stayed silent. It was, if anything, the most aggressively ordinary the building had felt in weeks, and that ordinariness pressed on me in a way that was somehow worse than if something had actively been happening, the way held breath gets harder to hold the longer nothing forces you to release it. The second hand started moving again at what my phone told me was 2:24. 7 minutes, by my count, though it felt much longer standing through it. It resumed exactly where it had stopped, sweeping smoothly past the 5 and the 6 as if nothing had interrupted it at all, and the store clock and my phone were perfectly in sync again within the hour, no drift, no correction needed. I didn't mention it to Carl. I didn't call Russell about this one either. I added it to my own list in my phone, the one separate from the binder, and underneath it I wrote something I still think about. Whatever this is, it isn't testing the rules anymore. It's testing what I do when there isn't one. I didn't know, that Tuesday, how soon I'd be tested again in a way the binder actually had prepared me for. But I think the clock was its own kind of warning, in hindsight, not a rule, but a rehearsal. A reminder that staying still, doing nothing, refusing to act, was sometimes the entire answer, even when nothing told you so directly. I'm going to tell you about one more night specifically, because it's the one that changed how I understand everything that came before it, and because it's the one where I came closest to breaking a rule for good. It was the second week of December, snow on the ground for the first time that season, the kind of dry powder that doesn't melt so much as get pushed around by wind. The store felt smaller in winter, the dark outside heavier, the awning hum somehow more present against the muffled quiet that snow puts over everything. Around 1 a.m., the bell above the door rang, and a man walked in. I knew immediately it was the same man from November. The canvas jacket, the unremarkable face, the boots that left no slush trail on the mat the way a real pair of boots should have after walking through 4 inches of new snow. I noticed that detail almost before I noticed his face. No wet tracks. No melting snow at all on his shoulders, though it had been coming down steadily for an hour. I felt the held breath feeling from before settle over me immediately, sharper this time, because I'd had weeks to think about what his last visit had actually been, a successful attempt to get my permission to be answered to in my own name, even if I hadn't understood that's what was happening until it was already done. He walked the same aisle. Picked up the same kind of jerky, a different flavor this time, which struck me as an oddly specific detail to notice and remember, the way your mind clings to small things when the large things are too frightening to look at directly. He set it on the counter along with a bottle of water, the same combination as before. "Cold one tonight," he said, which was the kind of thing anyone might say, and which I answered with something equally automatic, my voice sounding steadier in my own ears than I felt. I rang him up. I don't actually remember the total. I want to say it was an exact change, but I was so focused on the larger problem in front of me that I genuinely can't be sure, and that gap in my own memory bothers me even now. He paid. I gave him whatever change there was to give. The whole transaction felt like it was happening half a second out of sync with itself. Like watching a video with bad audio sync, my body going through the motions while the rest of me braced for what I knew was coming. He picked up his bag. He turned toward the door, the same as before, his hand reaching for the push bar. This time, I didn't wait for him to ask my name. I'd had weeks to think about this exact moment, and I'd decided, in the kind of decision you make alone at 3 in the morning, turning a problem over so many times it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like the only road left, that I would not let the window close on me again. If he was going to do what he'd done last time, say my name on his way out where I had no chance to correct it, I was going to get ahead of it. "Good night," I said before he could say anything at all. "Take care driving, the roads are bad." He stopped with his hand on the bar. He turned his head, not his whole body, just his head, the angle of it slightly wrong in a way I can't fully explain except to say that necks don't usually turn quite that far without the shoulders following, and he looked at me for a long moment. "You didn't tell me your name," he said. My heart was going so hard I could feel it in my throat. "No," I said. "I didn't." Something passed over his face that I want to call disappointment, but that didn't quite fit that word either. Something closer to a held expectation deflating, a script not followed. He looked at me a second longer. Then he said quietly, almost gently, "That's all right, Dana. I already know it." And he left. The bell rang. The door shut. No slush trail behind him on the mat, none on the floor where he'd stood, snow falling steadily outside the window onto a lot where, when I made myself look, really look, longer than was comfortable, there were no footprints leading away from the door at all. None leading to it either, when I checked the earlier footage. He'd simply been standing in the frame one moment, the bell already mid-ring, with no approach captured on camera at all. I didn't go outside. I locked the door for the next 20 minutes, an action that wasn't in any rule but felt necessary in the moment, my own addition to the binder's logic. I sat behind the counter with my knees pulled up, which I hadn't done since I was much younger and frightened of much smaller things, and I waited for the shift to end. I didn't go outside that night, and I think that's the only reason I'm able to write this down for you now. But here's the part that I keep turning over, the part that the binder's old note had only half prepared me for. He'd known my name before I ever gave it to him, both times. The first time, I told him anyway, out loud, the ordinary way, and the rule's real test had come after, in the brief window where I should have corrected him and couldn't, because he'd timed his exit to close that window before I had the chance. The second time, I'd refused to give him anything at all, no name, no opening, and he'd simply told me he already knew it, with no transaction to legitimize, no exchange for me to fail to complete. I understood, lying awake in my little room above the store that morning with the snow still coming down outside the blinds, that the rule had never been a test I could pass through cleverness. Avoiding the opening hadn't stopped him from saying my name. It had only changed whether the saying came wrapped in the ritual of permission or not. The first time, he needed me to participate, to say it first, to let the transaction almost complete itself, because the rule, whatever force had written it decades ago, existed to prevent exactly that kind of participation from happening cleanly. The second time, without my participation, he'd said it anyway, but differently. Gentler. Like something that no longer needed my consent because it had already gotten enough of it the first time to not need it again. I think that's what Glow broke, all those years ago, whatever it was Russell wouldn't tell me on the phone. I think she let the transaction complete itself once, the easy way, the way that felt like nothing at the time, paid for, thanked, said goodnight, didn't catch the open window in time, just like me, and I think that was enough. One time. That's all it took to start something that the rest of us, all the night clerks after her, have just been managing rather than preventing, 6 rules at a time, shift after shift, for longer than the binder's earliest legible page can even account for. I'm still working the night shift at Norbeck's. I want to be honest about why, because I think it would be easy for you to read all of this and wonder why on earth I haven't quit, haven't run, haven't called the police or a priest or anyone at all to make this someone else's problem. The truth is more practical and more uncomfortable than that. I asked Carl, carefully, a few weeks after the December night, whether the company had ever had trouble keeping night staff at this location. He told me, in the same flat, unbothered tone he uses for everything, that turnover was about average for overnight retail, and that the position had been filled continuously for as long as the store's records went back, one person handing it to the next, always with some kind of overlapped training period, never once sitting empty for more than a week. I think about that a lot. I think about the idea that someone has to be here, following these rules, every single night, or else the thing that's learned this building, the pump, the storeroom wall, the parking lot, my name, stops being managed at all. I don't know that for certain. Nobody who wrote in that binder over the years left behind anything certain. But I know what the quiet stretches feel like, and I know what the nights feel like when someone walks and not leaving tracks in fresh snow, and I know that every single time I have followed a rule instead of testing it, nothing worse has happened than fear. Around February, the store started running short-staffed again. Carl mentioned, almost in passing while counting the till one morning, that corporate wanted a second overnight name on file in case I ever needed a night off, which I hadn't taken once since I'd started. I didn't love the idea of training someone new. Some part of me had quietly settled into thinking of the rules as mine to manage, the way you get protective of a problem you've learned to live with even when you never wish it on anyone else. But I also understood, in the same practical way I'd understood everything else about this job, that the position needed two names on file whether I liked it or not, and that whoever filled it deserved to hear the rules from someone who'd actually tested them, rather than finding the binder cold on a slow night with no one to call. I trained my own replacement candidate last month, a kid named Theo, 20, working through community college, taking the room above the store the same way I once did, for the same reasons I once did. He had the same kind of broke and tired look I remembered having, the same careful way of asking how much the room actually cost against the hourly rate before he'd commit to anything. I liked him for that. It meant he paid attention to details, which I'd come to think mattered more in this job than almost anything else. I gave him the same binder. I told him the same 6 rules, in the same order, and I watched his face do the same thing my face must have done with Russell, that flicker of is this a joke sliding slowly, over the course of the week, into something more careful. I didn't tell him everything at once. I told him what Russell had told me, mostly, plus a little more, because I'd decided somewhere in the months since December that the next person after me deserved a slightly fuller picture than I'd gotten, even if I still couldn't give him the whole thing. I told him about the camera skip. I told him about the headlights. I held back the part about Rule 6 for longer than I probably should have, not because I wanted to protect him from it, but because I genuinely didn't know how to explain it in a way that wouldn't just sound like fear dressed up as caution. He hasn't started solo shifts yet. I'm still covering most nights while he shadows me, watching him learn the register, the safe drop, the way the second pump sticks sometimes and needs the breaker reset. He's a fast learner. He double-checks the storeroom door is shut before he goes to bed each morning without me ever telling him to, which I noticed and didn't comment on, because some things are better left as instincts a person finds on their own. Last night, a man in a canvas jacket came in around 2:40, bought a bag of jerky and a bottle of water, the same brand as always, paid in cash. He didn't say much. On his way out, his hand on the push bar, he glanced past me to where Theo was crouched behind the counter restocking the cigarette case, and he said, pleasant as anything, "Good night, Theo." I hadn't told him Theo's name. Nobody had. Theo looked up, confused, already starting to say how did he. I cut him off before he could finish the sentence, before any kind of acknowledgement could leave his mouth and close on itself the way these things seem to need closing. "Don't answer," I said. "Just don't answer him. We'll talk about it after he's gone." The bell rang. The door shut. No tracks in the slush on the mat. Theo sat very still for a long moment after the engine sound that never came finally didn't come, his hands flat on the counter, looking at me like he wanted permission to be as frightened as he clearly was. I told him it was all right to be. I told him that being frightened and still doing the job right were not opposites, that I'd learned that distinction the hard way, and he could learn it the easier way, from me, if he let himself. I'm writing this down because Theo asked me tonight, very quietly, very carefully, whether the rules ever stop. Whether there's a version of this job where you follow them long enough and the store just goes back to being an ordinary gas station on a quiet stretch of county road.